The spear pierced through the morning mist like divine judgment itself. And in that moment, everything the Philistine giant believed about invincibility shattered along with his skull. But this isn't the story you think you know. This isn't about David and Goliath. That tale has been told 1,000 times, sanitized and simplified for children's books and Sunday school lessons. This is about what came after, about the rage that consumed an entire family, about a brother's oath sworn over a cooling corpse, and about the secret buried so deep in ancient texts that most of the world has never heard it whispered. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church guards manuscripts that predate many biblical texts you've read, scrolls and codices written in Guizi, an ancient Semitic language that preserves stories edited out, forgotten, or deliberately suppressed by later scribes. Among these texts lies a narrative thread that changes everything we think we understand about the aftermath of that famous battle in the Valley of Elah. And at its center stands a figure whose very existence has been erased from mainstream biblical tradition: Ishbi-benob, Lami, and Saph, the brothers of Goliath, warriors who made their fallen sibling look almost reasonable by comparison. The story begins not with a sling and a stone, but with a sound, the wailing that rose from the Philistine camp when soldiers carried Goliath's headless body back from the valley, when his mother Orpah looked upon what remained of her firstborn son and released a scream that, according to Ethiopian texts, caused birds to fall dead from the sky. You see, the Bible mentions these brothers only in passing, tiny verses tucked away in 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles, easy to skip over, easier still to forget. But the Ethiopian tradition preserves something far more detailed, far more disturbing, and far more human than the sanitized version that survived. These weren't just random Philistine soldiers. They were the sons of Orpah, the same woman who appears in the book of Ruth, the woman who turned back from following Naomi while her sister-in-law Ruth continued on. And this choice, this single moment of hesitation, would echo through generations in ways that rabbinic tradition and Ethiopian manuscripts explore with shocking specificity. The ancient rabbis taught that Orpah, after leaving Naomi, descended into a life of prostitution and violence, that she bore 4 giants through various unions, and that these 4 brothers were destined from birth to seek vengeance against Israel. But the Ethiopian texts add layers of motivation, psychology, and detail that transform this from divine inevitability into human tragedy. Picture the scene. The Philistine city of Gath, the stronghold of giants, the morning after David's victory. Goliath's body lies in state, and his brothers, each standing between 9 and 12 feet tall according to various ancient measurements, gather around the corpse. The oldest surviving brother, Ishbi-benob, places his hand on Goliath's cold chest and speaks an oath that Ethiopian manuscripts preserve in chilling detail. He swears by Dagon, the fish god of the Philistines, that he will not only kill David but will make him suffer in ways that will make Goliath's quick death look like mercy, that he will destroy David's family line, that he will turn Israel's champion into a cautionary tale that mothers will use to frighten children for 1,000 years. But this wasn't just about brotherly revenge. The Ethiopian texts reveal political calculations that mainstream biblical narrative overlooks. Goliath wasn't simply a warrior. He was a symbol of Philistine military supremacy, a psychological weapon that had kept Israel cowering for 40 days. And his death didn't just embarrass the Philistine army, it shattered their entire military strategy, threatened their economic dominance over the region, and worst of all, made their gods look impotent before the God of Israel. The brothers understood that avenging Goliath meant more than personal vendetta. It meant restoring Philistine honor, proving that Goliath's defeat was a fluke, demonstrating that giants could still crush the armies of Israel, and most importantly, showing that Dagon hadn't been defeated by Yahweh but that his champion had simply been caught off guard. The Ethiopian Book of the Giants, distinct from but related to the Dead Sea Scrolls text of the same name, provides a narrative that follows Ishbi-benob's quest for revenge with the kind of detail that suggests oral traditions preserved by communities who never underwent the same editorial sanitization as canonical texts. According to these sources, Ishbi-benob spent years preparing, not rushing into battle like his impulsive brother had done, but studying David's tactics, learning his patterns, understanding his weaknesses. He discovered that David, despite his reputation for fearlessness, had a vulnerable moment, the period after battle when exhaustion made even the mighty king of Israel as weak as any ordinary man. The Ethiopian texts describe how Ishbi-benob forged a spear specifically designed to kill David, a weapon so heavy that normal men couldn't lift it, tipped with bronze that had been blessed by Philistine priests and cursed by Philistine witches, a spear that was said to have been quenched in the blood of Israelite prisoners to give it a taste for Hebrew flesh. He commissioned armor that made Goliath's equipment look primitive by comparison, chain mail so dense that arrows would shatter against it, a helmet with a face guard designed to prevent the kind of forehead shot that had killed his brother, and a shield so large it required 2 men to carry it into battle. But more than physical preparation, Ishbi-benob engaged in psychological warfare that the Ethiopian manuscripts detail with disturbing specificity. He would send messengers to the borders of Israel carrying pieces of fabric stained with blood, claiming they were from David's future corpse. He would sacrifice animals in rituals designed to curse the king of Israel, and he would sing songs in the Philistine camps that mocked David's God and promised creative tortures for the giant killer. The years passed and David's star rose higher. He became king first over Judah and then over all Israel. He established Jerusalem as his capital. He pushed back the Philistines and the Moabites and the Ammonites. He built an empire, but he never forgot that he had killed a giant, never forgot that giants had brothers. Never forgot that somewhere beyond his borders, something was waiting for him. The Ethiopian text suggests that David's famous psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd," wasn't written in peaceful contemplation but during a period of intense anxiety about the revenge that he knew was coming. That the valley of the shadow of death wasn't metaphorical but literal. The valleys where giants still dwelt, where Goliath's brothers still trained, where his own death was being meticulously planned. And then, decades after David felled Goliath, the revenge came. 2 Samuel chapter 21 describes it with characteristic biblical brevity. Moreover, the Philistines had yet war again with Israel, and David went down, and his servants with him, and fought against the Philistines, and David waxed faint. And Ishbi-benob, which was of the sons of the giant, the weight of whose spear weighed 300 shekels of brass in weight, he being girded with a new sword, thought to have slain David. But this clinical description hides the drama that Ethiopian manuscripts expand upon with novelistic detail. David was old now, perhaps in his 60s, still powerful but not the agile youth who had danced around Goliath's clumsy strikes. And on this particular day, after hours of fighting, his legendary energy finally failed him. The Ethiopian texts describe how the battle had been going poorly, how David had personally led a charge to break through Philistine lines, how he had killed dozens of men in a fury that reminded people why they once feared him, but how, inevitably, age and exhaustion caught up with him. He stumbled, whether over a body, a stone, or simply his own tired feet. The texts disagree, and in that moment of vulnerability, Ishbi-benob appeared. Imagine the scene. David on one knee, gasping for breath, his famous sword heavy in his hand, his vision blurring from exhaustion, and then a shadow falls over him, a shadow so large it blocks out the sun, and he looks up to see a face that resembles the face he saw in the valley of Elah 40 years earlier. The same broad features, the same contemptuous sneer, but worse, so much worse, because this giant isn't shouting challenges and giving speeches. This giant is just raising his spear for a killing strike, silent and efficient and inevitable. The Ethiopian manuscripts preserve what Ishbi-benob said in that moment. Words that never made it into the canonical Bible. "Your God saved you from my brother, shepherd boy, but where is he now? You killed Goliath with a stone to the head, so I'll crush your skull so thoroughly that your own mother wouldn't recognize the pieces. You cut off his head, so I'll take yours and carry it through every city of Israel until your people remember what it means to fear giants. You humiliated him before armies, so I'll humiliate you before your God. I'll make you cry out to Yahweh and let him hear your prayers go unanswered." David, according to these texts, tried to rise, tried to lift his sword, tried to summon the strength that had carried him through 1,000 battles, but his body betrayed him. His muscles refused to obey. His breath came in ragged gasps, and for the first time since he was a shepherd boy facing lions, David felt genuine terror. The spear began its descent, bronze glinting in the afternoon sun, and David closed his eyes. Not in prayer, not in acceptance, but simply because he couldn't bear to see it coming. And then another shadow joined the first, and metal rang against metal with a sound like thunder. Abishai, son of Zeruiah, David's nephew and one of his greatest warriors, had seen the king fall, had abandoned his own fight, had sprinted across the battlefield with a speed that seemed impossible for a man wearing armor, and had thrown himself between David and the descending spear. The Ethiopian texts describe this moment with a detail that suggests eyewitness testimony filtered through generations of oral tradition. Abishai's shield caught Ishbi-benob's spear shaft at an angle, deflecting it just enough that it missed David's head and instead crashed into the ground with such force that it embedded itself 2 feet deep into the earth. Ishbi-benob roared, a sound that the manuscripts describe as inhuman, bestial, filled with 40 years of hatred, and tried to wrench his spear free for another strike, but Abishai was already moving, his sword flashing toward the giant's legs, toward the one vulnerable spot in that massive armor, the gap between the greaves and the hip protection where a well-placed strike could sever the femoral artery. The giant felt the blade bite into his flesh and stumbled backward, yanking his spear from the ground and swinging it horizontally in an arc that would have decapitated Abishai if the warrior hadn't dropped flat against the earth. But that moment of evasion gave other Israelite soldiers time to arrive, drawn by the commotion, by the sight of their king in danger, and suddenly Ishbi-benob faced not one opponent but a dozen, then 2 dozen, then more. The Ethiopian manuscripts detail a battle within a battle, a desperate struggle that lasted until sunset, as Ishbi-benob fought with the fury of a man who had spent 40 years preparing for this moment and refused to let it slip away. He killed 7 men, according to the Ethiopian count, before a spear found the gap in his armor at the armpit, before a sword cut through the tendons of his ankle, before the accumulated wounds and the weight of his own massive armor finally dragged him to his knees. Abishai approached the fallen giant, and the Ethiopian texts preserve their final exchange with a poignancy absent from the canonical account. Ishbi-benob, bleeding from a dozen wounds, looked up at David's nephew and spoke, "Finish it quickly. My brother waited 40 days and died in minutes. I waited 40 years for revenge and failed in hours. Perhaps your God is stronger than ours after all, or perhaps justice is simply a story we tell ourselves to make sense of chaos." Abishai, according to these sources, responded not with triumph but with something approaching respect. "Your brother died with honor, facing a single opponent in fair combat. You attacked an exhausted old man. Whatever revenge you sought, you lost it when you chose ambush over challenge." And then he struck the killing blow, severing Ishbi-benob's head with a single cut, and carried it to David, who looked upon it with an expression the manuscripts describe as complicated: relief, certainly, but also sadness, perhaps even guilt, as if he recognized that killing Goliath all those years ago had set in motion a cycle of revenge that had now claimed another life. But the story doesn't end there, because Ishbi-benob wasn't the last brother, wasn't the final threat, wasn't the conclusion of the revenge saga that began in the Valley of Elah. The Ethiopian texts, along with 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles, document the other brothers, the other attempts, the other battles where giants tried to finish what Ishbi-benob had started. There was Saph, called Sippai in some texts, who challenged Israel at Gob and fell to Sibbecai the Hushathite, a warrior whose name is preserved in scripture but whose story is expanded in Ethiopian tradition as a man who specifically trained to fight giants, who studied their anatomy and learned their weaknesses, who made himself into a giant killer precisely because he understood that the sons of Orpah would keep coming until someone developed a systematic method for defeating them. The Ethiopian manuscripts describe Saph as the most cunning of the brothers, the one who learned from Ishbi-benob's failure, who didn't attack David directly but instead targeted Israelite cities, who tried to draw David out through strategic destruction rather than personal confrontation, and who nearly succeeded in burning Bethlehem, David's birthplace, before Sibbecai tracked him through the Judean wilderness and killed him in single combat that lasted from dawn until midday. Then there was Lami, explicitly identified in 1 Chronicles as the brother of Goliath the Gittite, who faced Elhanan son of Jair, and here the biblical text itself becomes confused and contradictory because 2 Samuel claims that Elhanan killed Goliath, not David, while 1 Chronicles clarifies that Elhanan killed Lami, Goliath's brother, and scholars have argued for millennia about whether this represents a textual error, a conflation of traditions, or evidence of multiple giant killings that later scribes compressed into the single famous story. The Ethiopian texts take a different approach, suggesting that Elhanan did kill a giant named Goliath, but that this was Goliath's younger brother who had taken his name as a kind of legacy, as a way of carrying on his reputation, and that the biblical confusion stems from the Philistine practice of naming sons after fallen warriors, so that there were multiple Goliaths, multiple giants bearing that name as both identifier and threat. According to these manuscripts, Lami called Goliath was the largest of all the brothers, standing nearly 13 feet tall by some measurements, and his spear wasn't just heavy. The text says the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, but was designed specifically to break through the shields and armor that Israelite warriors had developed in response to fighting giants. He carried multiple spears, throwing weapons that he could hurl with such force that they would pin men to the ground from 100 yards away, and he wore armor that covered every inch of his body except his eyes, learning from his brother's deaths that exposed flesh meant vulnerability. Elhanan, according to Ethiopian tradition, was a specialist, a man who had killed giants before, who understood their psychology and their tactics, and who approached the fight not as a test of strength but as a chess match, as a battle of positioning and patience. The manuscripts describe how he spent 3 days tracking Lami through the hills near Gath, studying his patterns, learning his rhythms, waiting for the perfect moment, and when that moment came, when Lami paused to drink from a stream, when he removed his helmet for just a moment to wipe sweat from his brow, Elhanan struck from concealment with an arrow that pierced the giant's eye and drove deep into his brain, killing him instantly, without glory, without dramatic confrontation, with just, efficient, brutal practicality. And finally, there was the unnamed giant of 2 Samuel chapter 21, the one described only as a man of great stature, that had on every hand 6 fingers, and on every foot 6 toes, 24 in number, and he also was born to the giant. This warrior, the Ethiopian text's name is Anak or sometimes Adoninak, and they describe him as the youngest brother, the one who grew up surrounded by the corpses of his siblings, who watched each brother leave to seek revenge against Israel and none return, who understood intellectually that he too would die but couldn't escape the obligation of blood, couldn't ignore the oath his mother Orpah had extracted from all her sons, that they would not rest while David lived, that they would pursue Israel until either the giant killer was dead or the line of Orpah was extinct. This final brother, according to the manuscripts, didn't want revenge. He wanted escape, wanted to flee to Egypt or Phoenicia, wanted to abandon the cycle of violence that had consumed his family. But Philistine culture and his mother's curse and his own sense of honor trapped him in a role he didn't choose. He challenged Israel not at Gob or Gath but at Jerusalem itself, marching to the very gates of David's city and demanding single combat, not with David, who was by now too old to fight, but with David's champion, whoever Israel would send. Jonathan, son of Shimei, David's nephew, accepted the challenge, and the Ethiopian texts describe this final confrontation with a melancholy absent from the others, as if even the scribes who recorded it recognized the futility, the tragedy, the senselessness of this last death in a feud that should have ended decades ago. The 6-fingered giant fought without real enthusiasm, going through the motions of combat because honor demanded it, but without the fire that had driven his brothers. And when Jonathan's spear finally found the gap between his ribs, the manuscripts say that his last words were not a curse or a threat, but simply finally. His death marked the end of the line of giants born to Orpah, the conclusion of a revenge saga that had spanned 4 decades and claimed 5 brothers. And with it came a kind of exhausted peace, not triumphant victory but mutual depletion, as if both sides recognized that the cost of this feud had far exceeded whatever glory or satisfaction it might have provided. But the Ethiopian texts don't end the story there, because they preserve something that canonical scripture only hints at: the aftermath, the question of what all this bloodshed meant, the theological wrestling with whether this cycle of revenge was divine justice, human folly, or something more complex. The manuscripts include a section they call the Lament of Orpah, a poetic text that purports to be the words of the giant's mother after her last son's death. And whether this represents actual historical material or later theological reflection, it provides a haunting counterpoint to the military narrative. Orpah, in this text, speaks to Ruth, her sister-in-law, the one who made the opposite choice, the one who continued with Naomi and eventually became the great-grandmother of David himself. And she asks the question that haunts all revenge narratives. You chose loyalty and inherited blessing. I chose independence and inherited death. You bore a line that would produce kings. I bore giants who became corpses. Was my choice wrong? Or was this always our destiny? Written before we made any decision, predetermined by a God who needed heroes and therefore needed monsters for those heroes to slay. This theological wrestling continues in Ethiopian commentaries that surround the core narrative, rabbinic-style discussions that debate whether the giants' deaths were just punishment for Orpah's abandonment of Naomi, whether they were victims of circumstance born into a conflict they didn't create, whether their desire for revenge was morally justified even if tactically doomed, and whether David himself bore any guilt for killing Goliath in the first place, for starting a cycle that would claim 5 more lives before it concluded. Some of these commentaries argue that David's killing of Goliath was divinely ordained and therefore beyond moral questioning, that the giants represented a corrupted bloodline that needed to be eliminated, that their deaths were necessary for Israel's survival and prosperity. Others take a more nuanced view, suggesting that David's act of killing Goliath, while necessary in context, carried karmic consequences that he could never escape, that the guilt of taking a life, even in legitimate combat, marked him for the rest of his days, and that the suffering he experienced in his later years, the rebellion of his son Absalom, the death of his infant son with Bathsheba, the constant warfare that defined his reign, were all connected to that initial act of violence in the Valley of Elah. The Ethiopian texts preserve a tradition that David, in his old age, after all of Goliath's brothers were dead, commissioned a monument to be built on the spot where Goliath had fallen. Not a triumphal arch celebrating his own victory, but a more ambiguous structure that acknowledged the human cost of warfare, the families destroyed by combat, the cycles of revenge that military triumph initiates. Whether such a monument actually existed historically is impossible to verify, but the tradition itself reveals a moral sophistication often absent from simplified retellings of the David and Goliath story, a recognition that every dead giant was someone's brother, someone's son, someone whose death would create ripples of grief and rage that would eventually return to their source. The Ethiopian Church preserved these texts partially because they align with the Church's broader theological emphasis on complexity, on the recognition that biblical heroes were flawed human beings rather than plaster saints, that divine plans often work through morally ambiguous means, that suffering and violence can be both necessary and tragic simultaneously. The Church Fathers who copied and studied these manuscripts saw in the story of Goliath's brothers a parable about the dangers of revenge, the futility of violence as a solution to violence, the way that killing creates obligations and debts that extend far beyond the immediate act. They drew parallels to New Testament teachings about forgiveness and breaking cycles of retribution, suggesting that the story of the giant's revenge was preserved precisely as a negative example, as a warning about what happens when injury is met with counter-injury, when blood demands blood, when the logic of vengeance is allowed to run its course. But there's another dimension to why these texts survived in Ethiopia and not elsewhere, a historical and cultural context that makes the preservation of this particular narrative especially significant. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has always existed at the margins of mainstream Christianity, geographically isolated from the centers of theological power in Rome, Constantinople, and Jerusalem, and this isolation allowed it to preserve traditions and texts that elsewhere were edited, suppressed, or forgotten. The Church maintained its own canon of Scripture that includes books rejected by other Christian traditions, the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and others, and within this more expansive biblical library, the story of Goliath's brothers found space to exist in detail rather than as fragmentary verses. The question of why mainstream biblical tradition condensed this story to mere verses while Ethiopian tradition expanded it involves complex discussions about redaction, about theological priorities, about what different communities of faith considered important to preserve. The Hebrew Bible editors working after the Babylonian exile were focused on portability and essential narrative, creating texts that could be copied quickly and carried easily, and in that process, many details were compressed or eliminated. Later Christian editors working on what would become the canonical Bible were interested in typology and prophecy, in showing how Old Testament events prefigured New Testament realities, and the story of David defeating Goliath fit that framework perfectly. David as a type of Christ, defeating an enemy who represented sin and death. But the messy aftermath of revenge and counter-revenge complicated that clean typology, so it was mentioned briefly and moved past quickly. Ethiopian tradition, less concerned with typological neatness and more interested in the full complexity of human moral experience, preserved the complications, the ambiguities, the troubling questions that simpler narratives obscure. And yet, even within Ethiopian tradition, these texts exist in a strange liminal space, not fully canonical but not entirely apocryphal either, copied and studied but not always read publicly, acknowledged but not emphasized. It's as if even the Ethiopian scribes recognized that this material complicated comfortable narratives, that it raised questions easier left unasked, that it transformed a story of triumphant faith into something more psychologically realistic and therefore more disturbing. Modern scholars who encounter these manuscripts face their own interpretive challenges. How much of this material represents authentic ancient tradition preserved independently, and how much represents later elaboration and theological reflection? The linguistic analysis suggests that core elements of the narrative are very old, possibly contemporary with the biblical text itself, while other sections show signs of later composition, perhaps during the medieval period when Ethiopian Christianity was developing its distinctive theological voice. The truth, as always with ancient texts, lies somewhere in the layers, in the recognition that stories evolve through repeated telling, that each generation adds its own concerns and questions to inherited narrative, that the version we read today represents centuries of scribal work, theological debate, and cultural transmission. What remains consistent across all versions and all layers is the core reality. David killed a giant, that giant had brothers, those brothers sought revenge, and they all died trying to achieve it. This simple sequence of events becomes, in its retelling and elaboration, a lens through which to examine fundamental questions about justice and revenge, about whether violence can ever truly be answered with more violence, about the obligations of family and honor, about whether it's possible to break cycles of retribution or whether they must simply run their course until exhaustion or extinction. The Ethiopian text suggests that even David himself, the man after God's own heart, struggled with these questions, that he understood intellectually that killing Goliath had been necessary but felt in his heart the weight of having created orphans and widowers, of having initiated a sequence of deaths that wouldn't conclude until his own soldiers had killed every one of Goliath's brothers. There's a tradition, preserved in some Ethiopian commentaries, that David refused to celebrate the deaths of the giants, that he commanded his men not to parade their severed heads through Jerusalem, that he insisted on giving them honorable burial, and that when Orpah finally died, some texts say of grief, others say she lived to extreme old age, David sent emissaries to her funeral to pay respects, not because he felt guilty for defending Israel, but because he recognized in her suffering a mirror of his own losses, a reminder that every military victory has a human cost on both sides. Whether this tradition is historically accurate is less important than what it reveals about the values of those who preserved it. Their insistence that even justified violence requires acknowledgement and lament, that triumph without tragedy is a lie we tell ourselves to sleep better at night, that the full truth of warfare includes not just the winner's glory but the loser's grief. This understanding, woven throughout the Ethiopian manuscripts, represents a kind of moral realism that mainstream biblical interpretation often lacks, a willingness to sit with discomfort rather than resolve it quickly through appeals to divine will or military necessity. The story of Goliath's brothers also raises questions about historical reliability and the relationship between scripture and tradition that scholars continue to debate. The canonical Bible mentions these brothers in only the briefest terms: Ishbi-benob in 2 Samuel 21 verse 16 through 17, Saph in verse 18, Lami in 1 Chronicles 20 verse 5, and the six-fingered giant in 2 Samuel 21 verse 20 through 21. While the Ethiopian texts provide names, motivations, detailed battle descriptions, and psychological profiles. Are these elaborations based on authentic traditions that somehow survived outside the canonical textual stream? Or are they later literary expansions designed to fill gaps and answer questions that the biblical text leaves open? The answer probably involves both: core elements of the story, that these giants existed, that they fought against David's warriors, that they all died, appear to be historically reliable based on their presence in multiple independent textual traditions, while the specific details of their motivations, their preparations, and their final words likely represent later narrative development, the kind of storytelling that happens whenever a community retells its foundational stories across generations. This blending of history and interpretation doesn't make the texts less valuable. It simply means we need to read them with awareness that we're accessing not just events, but the meaning those events held for the communities that preserved them. The theological dimension that Ethiopian tradition emphasizes, the question of why God allowed this cycle of revenge to continue, why he didn't simply protect David from all subsequent threats after the initial miracle in the Valley of Elah, points to a sophisticated understanding of divine action that respects human agency even when that agency leads to destructive choices. The Ethiopian commentaries suggest that God intervened to save David from Ishbi-benob through Abishai, not because David deserved special protection, but because David's story wasn't yet finished, because he still had purposes to fulfill, but that this intervention didn't negate the natural consequences of violence, didn't erase the brothers' agency or their right to seek revenge, didn't make the world simple or safe or predictable. God works through history but doesn't override it, provides protection but doesn't eliminate danger, offers grace but doesn't cancel consequences. This is the theological vision embedded in these texts, a vision that accepts paradox and ambiguity rather than resolving everything into simple categories of good and evil, divine and human, justice and mercy. The psychological realism of the Ethiopian texts also stands out. These aren't cardboard villains seeking revenge for no reason beyond evil, but rather human beings trapped in cultural obligations, familial expectations, and emotional responses that make perfect sense within their context. Ishbi-benob isn't wrong to want revenge for his brother's death. Within the honor culture of ancient Near Eastern warfare, his response is entirely expected and even admirable in its way. He waited, he prepared, he acted strategically rather than impulsively. The tragedy isn't that he sought revenge, but that the entire system of blood debt and honor violence creates situations where understandable human responses lead inevitably to death, where both sides can be simultaneously right and wrong, justified and doomed. This moral complexity makes the Ethiopian version of the story far more interesting than simple retellings where giants are monsters and Israelites are heroes. Instead, we get humans on both sides, making choices that seem reasonable from their perspectives, caught in conflicts larger than themselves, dying for causes that matter intensely to them even if, from the outside, we can see the futility. The story also illuminates the nature of fame and its consequences, a theme that resonates across cultures and centuries. David became famous for killing Goliath, and that fame defined the rest of his life. It brought him to Saul's attention, helped him become king, made his name legendary, but it also made him a target, marked him for revenge. ensured that he would spend decades looking over his shoulder, wondering when the next brother would appear, when his past would catch up with him. There's a modern parable hidden in this ancient story. Every action has consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment. Every victory creates enemies. Every triumph over adversity writes checks that must eventually be cashed. David probably never considered, as he picked up those 5 smooth stones from the brook, that he was starting a 40-year blood feud, that his moment of heroism would doom 5 men to die seeking vengeance, that his fame would become both blessing and curse. The Ethiopian texts suggest he came to understand this later, that his wisdom literature, the Psalms, his reputed sayings, reflected this hard-won knowledge that violence begets violence, that the sword doesn't stay in its sheath once drawn, that there's no such thing as clean victory in warfare, only different degrees of mess and moral compromise. The preservation of these texts in Ethiopia also speaks to the importance of marginal traditions in maintaining alternative perspectives on dominant narratives. If we relied solely on the canonical Hebrew Bible and Christian Old Testament, we would have only the barest outline of Goliath's brother's revenge, a few verses easily skipped over, questions easily ignored. But because Ethiopian Christianity maintained an independent textual tradition, because it valued comprehensiveness over brevity, because it asked different questions than other Christian communities, we have access to a fuller, more complex version of the story that challenges and enriches our understanding. This is why scholars increasingly recognize the importance of studying not just the canonical texts but the vast array of non-canonical, apocryphal, and alternative traditions that various communities preserved. Not because these texts have the same authority as Scripture, but because they preserve perspectives, questions, and narrative elements that mainstream redaction eliminated or compressed, and in that preservation, they offer us a more three-dimensional view of the ancient world and its moral imagination. The story of Goliath's brothers reminds us that every biblical text is a selection, that behind every verse lie hundreds of untold stories, that the Bible as we know it represents choices made by editors about what to include and what to leave out, and that those choices reflected theological and practical priorities that excluded much of the human complexity surrounding these events. Ethiopian tradition, by preserving what mainstream tradition compressed, gives us back some of that complexity, forces us to confront questions about revenge and justice that simpler narratives allow us to avoid, and reminds us that the heroes of faith were morally compromised human beings rather than superhuman paragons. The final theological question the Ethiopian texts wrestle with is perhaps the most troubling. Were the giants' deaths just? Not practically justified, clearly they threatened Israel and needed to be stopped, but just in a deeper moral sense? Did they deserve death for seeking revenge against the man who killed their brother? Were they villains for honoring their family obligations? Or were they victims of a cultural system that gave them no choice but to seek blood for blood? The Ethiopian commentaries refuse to provide a simple answer, instead presenting multiple perspectives. One commentator argues that the giants were cursed from birth through their mother Orpah's sin in abandoning Naomi, that their deaths were punishment for ancestral failures. Another suggests that they were tragic figures trapped by culture and circumstance. A third proposes that they were both, that human responsibility and divine decree coexist, that they made choices freely even though those choices were also somehow fated, that they could have chosen differently but couldn't have chosen differently, the kind of paradox that theological traditions from Augustine to Calvin to Arminius would later wrestle with more systematically, but that Ethiopian tradition recognized intuitively in its reading of this story. What makes this particularly interesting is that these questions aren't abstract theology but arise directly from narrative. The Ethiopian texts force these questions precisely by humanizing the giants, by giving them motivations and fears and doubts, by showing them as men who die rather than monsters who are eliminated. When Ishbi-benob says, "Perhaps your God is stronger than ours after all," he's not just acknowledging military defeat but expressing genuine theological uncertainty, wondering if his entire worldview has been wrong, if the faith he grew up with was a lie, if his brother died pointlessly and he's about to die pointlessly too. This moment of doubt, preserved in the Ethiopian tradition, transforms the story from triumphalist military history into something approaching tragedy, where everyone suffers, everyone loses something precious, and even the winners are diminished by what they've had to do to win. The modern reader encountering this material faces interpretive choices about how to understand it, as history, as theology, as literature, or as some combination of all three. The academic approach treats it primarily as a window into ancient textual traditions, analyzing its language and themes to understand how different communities read and interpreted biblical narratives. The devotional approach treats it as spiritual teaching, mining it for lessons about revenge, violence, faith, and human nature. The literary approach treats it as powerful storytelling, appreciating its narrative techniques, character development, and tragic structure. All three approaches have merit, and none excludes the others. The texts are historically significant and theologically rich and literarily powerful simultaneously, and trying to reduce them to only one dimension impoverishes our understanding. What's clear is that whoever composed and preserved these Ethiopian texts about Goliath's brothers, whether they were ancient chroniclers recording oral traditions,